Good afternoon and welcome to another lecture in our series, Reasons for Hope. As always, I want to welcome members of the faculty, staff, and students of CU, but extend a particularly warm welcome to anybody who's coming in from outside and joining the CU community for this lecture. I welcome our friends and colleagues from other academic institutions across the city, and I welcome distinguished members of the diplomatic community. We run an ongoing seminar for ambassadors and senior members of delegations across Budapest, and we're always delighted to see our diplomatic colleagues. Let me just say also that you're here, your presence is a testimony to the impact that Chantal Mouffe has had on our thinking about democracy, populism, and political theory more generally. She's the Emeritus Professor of Political Theory at the Center for the Study of Democracy at the University of Westminster in London, and she is currently spending a year at what could be called, without too much exaggeration, our sister institution, the IWM in Vienna. And so we welcome her from Vienna, and we welcome her from London. She's also a corresponding member of the Collège International de Philosophie in Paris. And we associate her thinking and her work with two concepts that have been enormously influential in our thinking about democracy. One is the idea of agonistic democracy, which I will leave Professor Mouffe to expound, but has influenced me in its emphasis on the fact that what we're seeking is not a democracy based on consensus, but in fact, the very purpose of democracy is to encourage and create the space for pluralistic, fundamental, agonistic debate. The second idea that we associate commonly with her work is the idea of left populism. Populism is commonly used as a kind of scare word. Chantal Mouffe is asking us to think much more seriously about the possibility that there are varieties of populism to the left, to the right, and we need to distinguish clearly between types and forms of populism, depending on their commitment to democracy, depending on their commitment to human rights, depending on their commitment to certain values. It depends very much how you define this word, and her contribution to this has been extremely important. She is the author of Dimensions of Radical Democracy, Pluralism, Citizenship, Community from 1992. She's the author of The Democratic Paradox. She's written a book in the Name of the People on Podemos, and she's just recently put out a book called For a Left Populism, published in 2019 by Verso. We're delighted to have her here. She's going to speak about affect, emotion, passion in politics, and the mastery and organization of those emotions. And I, on your behalf, want to welcome Chantal Mouffe to CU.
Thank you very much, Michael Ignatia, for this invitation to give a lecture in this Reason for Hope, and I hope to be able to bring you some hope, not absolutely secure, but at least show that there is possibility for hope. The future is not so dark, so absolutely dark as it might seem at some point. When we examine the present state of democracy, one of the assertions that we often come across is that our current condition is one of post-democracy. The meaning conveyed by this notion of post-democracy is that modern democracy, while maintaining the facade of formal democratic principle, are increasingly controlled by privileged elites. By the way, this concept of post-democracy is particularly associated with the work of Colin Crouch, which is a British political theorist. But Jacques Rancière also used it in different ways. But I think Colin Crouch is the one he wrote a book about that. So he's usually associated with it. And in fact, he's the one who insists precisely on this dimension that I've just mentioned. The implementation of neoliberal policies has led to the colonization of the state by corporate interests, and public political decisions are now taken outside of the traditional democratic channels. This is at the origin of the loss of legitimacy of democratic institutions, which manifests itself in a growing phenomenon of abstention. That's very classic of the situation in Western Europe. Well, in a book published in 2005 on the political, I have examined the reason for what I call the post-political perspective, which has become dominant in liberal democratic societies. In fact, in a way, I think it's important to see that as the origin of post-democracy. I have argued that it is linked to the move toward the centers, which in the last decade has been the strategy of social democratic parties in Europe. A strategy that, under the motto of the Third Way, was first elaborated in Britain by New Labour. One of the theorists was Anthony Giddens. And of course, this was put in practice by Tony Blair. According to this approach, Western societies have entered a second stage of modernity, one what they call of reflexive modernization. By the way, we find also something similar in the work of Ulrich Beck in Germany. From a certain time, they were, in fact, developing this theory together. So reflexive modernization, and the idea is that the adversarial model of politics, which is a characteristic, according to Beck and Giddens, the first stage of simple modernization, this model has become obsolete. Giddens claimed that it is not necessary to think beyond left and right. In fact, that's the title of one of his books. And we need to envisage a new politics. Beck wrote a book about new politics, what they call a radical center, that is, which transcends the old-fashioned left-right divide. Well, such a view was later adopted by other socialist and social democratic parties, which began to present themselves as center-left. Under the pretense of modernizing the social democratic project, because they said it needed to be adapted to a globalized world, center-left parties, in fact, have, we could say, capitulated to neoliberalism. Convinced that there was no alternative to the current form of globalized financial capitalism, they have accepted the framework established by neoliberal hegemony. That was very clear in Britain with the case of Tony Blair, who, when he came to power, did not at all put into question the hegemony, neoliberal hegemony that had been established by Margaret Thatcher, but simply tried to, in fact, do some kind of more humane form. I remember the time I wrote an article called Blairism, Thatcherism with a Human Face. And in fact, that, of course, was very typical of the famous Third Way. Having abandoned any attempt to challenge the existing relation of power, they limited themselves to propose way, as I was saying, to humanize neoliberal globalization. And of course, this is why their policies, were in fact very difficult to distinguish from the center-right parties. This is what I have called the consensus at the center, rapprochement between center-right and center-left. Well, it seems to me that in the discussion about post-democracy, the role played by this post-political situation is not sufficiently taken into account. It is, of course, necessary to grasp the transformation of the capitalist system, which have provided the economic condition for the success of neoliberal globalization. But that does not automatically explain the reason for the disappearance of a vibrant democratic debate about the different ways in which social relations and public institutions can be organized. By failing to acknowledge that politics is intrinsically partisan, that's one of the main theses I've developed through my work, and that democratic politics requires a choice between real alternatives. You know, when citizens go to vote, they need to really a choice. And this is what I call an agonistic debate between conflicting projects. And this, of course, is what was eliminated by this consensus at the center. So this consensual politics of the third way, in fact, have contributed to the disaffection with politics, which is at the core of our present post-democratic situation. So I think it's important for me to see that it began, in the 80s with what was happening in Britain. When citizens feel that they cannot have a say in fundamental decisions which concern their common affairs, and that political questions are dealt with by experts because they are considered of a technical nature, democratic institutions are emptied of their substance, and their legitimacy is threatened. This is clear when it's evident that if you accept that there is no alternative to neoliberal globalization, then it means that political decisions, well, they are only technical. There is no real choice that is at stake, no alternative. So they are technical decisions, and if they are technical decisions, it's better that it's experts who solve them. And why should the citizen, have a say in that? And I think that that's something which has been extremely important as a consequence of, the transformation of social democratic parties in what we can rather call social liberal parties, which are, of course, is at the origin of the crisis of social democracy. Because elections are reduced to providing a rubber stamp for measures imposed by a variety of actors whose interests are not publicly accountable, and we could say that the democratic process loses its raison d'être. I mean, this, of course, is one of the characteristics of post-democracy. To be sure, our societies still claim to be democratic, but what's the meaning of democracy in our post-political times? Well, I think that it's important to think a little bit about what democracy really means. And I've scrutinized the nature of our Western democracy, liberal democracy, in a book which is called The Democratic Paradox. And there I brought to the fore the tension existing between the two ethico-political principles of this liberal democracy. Here I insist when I speak of liberal, it's only in the sense of political liberalism and nothing to do with economic liberalism. So those two ethico-political principles are liberty and equality. Liberal democracy should be understood, in fact, as the articulation between two different traditions. On one side, there is the liberal tradition of the rule of law, individual rights, separation of power, and on the other side, there is the democratic tradition of popular sovereignty. The Canadian political theorist C.B. Macpherson has shown how, through this articulation between the liberal and the democratic tradition, which he said was established during the 19th century, liberalism was democratized and democracy was liberalized. And this is, I think, a characteristic of our model of democracy, because we speak of democracy, in fact, there is a specific Western model, and part of my work is to precisely insist that there are other ways in which the democratic principle can be inscribed. So I've been arguing with Habermas for a long time about the idea that we should not universalize our model, saying this is the only way in which democracy should be understood. This is the way which exists for us. It's our form of life, as Wittgenstein will say. And of course, we will defend allegiance to this form of life, but we should not pretend that, in China, in Africa, in the Muslim world, they should apply that model. I don't think that democratization necessarily means Westernization. So what's important in this liberal democratic model is that there is in fact always a tension between the exigencies of liberty and those of equality. Some people, of course, there's a long discussion about that. Carl Schmitt, for instance, believes that there is a contradiction between liberalism and democracy. For him, liberalism negates democracy, democracy negates liberalism. On the other side, we've got Jürgen Habermas, who speak of the co-originality between liberty and, and equality. Well, in the democratic paradox, I take a different position. I say that there's certainly not a contradiction, but there's certainly no co-originality. There is a tension between the two. A tension which I think is productive. It's not something that we should try to eliminate, because it is a tension which provides the dynamic of the confrontation between left and right. In fact, this is where the agonistic is in this tension that the agonistic debate can take place, and this is what guarantees pluralism. I think that the history of democratic politics in the Western world can be visualized in terms of the struggle for the predominance of one of these principles over the other. In some period, the liberal principle was dominant. In other, it was the democratic one. But, and what this was important, the contestation always remained open. That this tension always was at work. What has happened under the current hegemony of neoliberalism is that the liberal component has become so dominant that the democratic one is almost disappeared. Democracy is now understood simply in terms of rule of law and defense of human rights, but defense of human rights understood in a very specific neoliberal sense. And of course, the idea of popular sovereignty has been relinquished as being obsolete. Often people say, popular sovereignty in time of globalization, we can't speak about that anymore. I think that's something important to understand populism. Those who resist the rule of the elites and insist on the need to give a voice to the people, to make room for their demands, are being accused of being populist and presented as representing a danger for democracy. Well, in my view, this displacement of the democratic tradition by the liberal one is one of the main features of our post-democratic condition. And it is clearly visible in the abandon by center-left parties of the struggle for equality, equality being with popular sovereignty the other central element of the democratic tradition. Their main slogans are now about choice, fairness, equity, and inclusion. I remember Tony Blair, for instance, would say, choice, I'm going to give you choice. You will be able to choose your school, your doctor, and that's what became the main motto in the third way, choice. But of course, they are at pains to avoid speaking of equality, because they consider the notion of equality as being too tainted by the equalitarianism of the socialist ideal that they have repudiated. Deprived of the vocabulary that constituted the backbone of a left vision of society, it's not surprising, therefore, that the left has been unable to envisage an alternative to neoliberal globalization. And in fact, the whole crisis and current crisis, for instance, of social democracy, I think is very much linked to that, the fact that they don't really have the value that were central to them has been eviscerated. Well, this is to refer to a period which is changing. So this is why I think we can have a little bit of hope, but there is also danger. Because I think that after years of post-politic and unchallenged neoliberal hegemony, all this moment in which the third way was the dominant. By the way, it's not completely disappeared because, for instance, Macron in France is reviving. That's for me. The way we've been in Britain, the time Tony Blair is rather interesting to see that what is presented in France as a new politic with Macron is exactly, the application 30 years later in France of the Blairism. In fact, I wrote some time ago a tribune for Le Monde where it was called Macron, the stade supreme of post-politics. Because, in fact, in the case of Tony Blair, there was still alternation, center right, center left. Macron wants to get rid completely of that. No more left, no more right, all in one party, which is La République En Marche. No? There's nothing very original about that. We've seen that in Britain 30 years ago. But so this is changing fundamentally because we are seeing now some kind of, I will even go to the point of saying that we are witnessing a crisis of neoliberal hegemony. And this is manifested by the emergence of political movement rejecting post-democracy and its claim that there is no alternative to neoliberal globalization. So my point here is that today we are in a different conjuncture than the one that I analyzed, for instance, on the political. And this is this conjuncture that I have tried to analyze in my more recent book, For Left Populism. Because I think that this rejection of post-politics and post-democracy that we are seeing through the years of protest movement and new is something that can, of course, bring danger, obviously, but also some hope. And the rejection of post-politics and post-democracy manifests itself under the form of a drawing of a political frontier, something which is really a break with post-politics. Post-politics is that there is no political frontier. You know, no. That's typical liberal idea. And Tony Blair used to say, for instance, we are all middle class, no? So you know what we should all agree. No political frontier. Well, this is changing, because in fact, no, we are seeing a series of movements who are drawing a frontier in a populist mode. That is, on the mode of the people versus the establishment. And this is why I propose to speak of a populist moment. Here I want to make some little aside to say that it's interesting to compare our situation today to the one that Karl Polanyi, here in fact speaking in Hungary, I'm really glad to refer to Polanyi, which I think is really one of very, very important political thinker. Thank God he is being rediscovered. Well, he might not have, he never completely disappeared, but I think his importance now is really being recognized. Well, there is a lot of people talking, it's coming back of the 30s, but on a mode, you know, fascism. I think that there is some analogy with the 13 in the following way, because I think that Polanyi, in The Great Transformation, analyzed what he called the double movement. And he said, for instance, that the movement that took place in the 30s were, in fact, a movement of resistance against what had been the consequence of the marketization of society, what was the product of the first globalization. And so he showed how this movement, it was followed in the 30s by a double movement, a movement of reaction against that. The society began to defend itself against this aggression by the market. But, and this is what I think is very important and is similar to our situation, he also indicated that this reaction, this moment of protection, could take many different forms, and it took many different forms. It can be regressive or progressive. And for instance, regressive, because of course this is, you know, it took the form of fascism and Nazism, but it also could be something that were in the sense of reaffirmation of democracy, and that's the case of the New Deal of FDR, you know, because what Roosevelt did was precisely to take advantage of this situation in order to make some redistributive measure and democratize society. So I think, and that's what where I think that there is, you know, both hope and danger. We are in a situation which is analogous today. What I call the populist moment is precisely a moment in which all those resistances against post-democracy, you know, can lead to very different solutions, different issues, according to the fact, is it going to be populism of the right or populism of the left, which is going to become dominant. What is at stake in this populist moment is how the resistances to post-democracy are going to be articulated, and how this, you know, frontier, people, establishment people, elites, is going to be constructed. Because there are indeed many ways in which that can be done. And it's clear that when I speak of the people is a political category, political construction. The people is not the population. And a lot of people have got difficulties in understanding that. You know, the people is never the people, it's not an empirical reference, not a sociological category. It's a construction. And of course, it can be constructed in different ways. There are some construction of the political frontier which can have egalitarian objective, but not all construction of political frontier have political egalitarian objective. Even when the rejection of the existing system is made in the name of giving power back to the people. And that, of course, is very much the discourse of right-wing populism. We are going to give, by the elites, if taken your voice, or we are going to give you that. No, but even if it's the case, it can construct it in a way which is not going to develop democracy. Both types of populism aim to federate unsatisfied demand, and they federate precisely people wanting, reacting against post-politics, wanting to have a voice. But I think there is a motto of the Indignados in Spain, which I think is very appropriate. They used to say, tenemos voto, pero no tenemos voz. We've got a vote, but we don't have a voice. And of course, if you go to vote at the moment in which basically between left and right, center, center, there's no big difference. You have a vote, but you don't have a voice, And I think that this is the reaction against that are demand which can be federated in different ways. The difference lies in how the we, the people, is going to be constructed, and how its adversary, the them, the elites, is also going to be constructed. Right-wing populism claims that it will bring back popular sovereignty and restore democracy, but this sovereignty is understood as national sovereignty. And it's reserved for the people who are deemed to be the true nationals. Right-wing populism does not address the demand of equality, and they construct a people that exclude numerous categories, usually, of course, the immigrants, seen as a threat to the identity and the prosperity of the nation. It is, we could say, a form of politics of immunization, against the threat that those other groups represent for our identity. Their victory could lead to nationalistic authoritarian form of illiberal democracy, in that in the name of recovering democracy, in fact, this movement drastically restricts democracy. This is the danger of right-wing populism. And obviously the objective of a left populism should be completely different. It's also a question of recovering democracy, struggle against for democracy, but in order to deepen and to extend, to radicalize it. The social democratic parties, who in many countries have played an important role in the implementation of neoliberal policy, this is something that must be acknowledged, are not able to grasp the nature of the populist movement and to face the challenge that it represents. Of course, their traditional answer is to classify right-wing populists as extreme right, neo-fascists, or they attribute their appeal to lack of education, or the fact that people move by a negative passion as they see. And this, of course, we must realize is very convenient for them and for the center left in general, because it is an easy way to disqualify those movements without recognizing the center-left own responsibility in such an emergence. Because I think, and that's also an argument I'm making, that not exclusively, but there are many parts of people, particularly the working class, who, and that's clearly the case in France, but also in Austria, for example, who are voting for those right-wing populist parties because they've been abandoned by social democrats, who they decided not to address their demand anymore. So I think that this is something that those parties should they should make an autocritic. But of course, by presenting that it's a return of the blonde plague, some kind of meteorological phenomenon, we don't have anything to do. We're not responsible. Of course, this, of course, is good. It's a position which is convenient because it does not eliminate any responsibility from their part in this movement. But of course, it does not help to understand the reason for those movements. By establishing some kind of moral frontier, so to exclude the extremists from the democratic debate, the good Democrats believe that they can stop the rise of what they see as irrational passion. I think that such a strategy of demonization of the enemies of the bipartisan consensus can certainly be morally comforting, but it is totally politically disempowering because they cannot recognize that many of the demands articulated by right-wing populist parties are, in fact, the origin. They are democratic demands, in a sense, insisting here on the fact that as far as they are reaction against post-democracy, it's a demand for democracy. And the question is that the left need to give a progressive answer to those demands instead of leaving right-wing populist to articulate them in a xenophobic way. To stop the rise of right-wing populist parties, we need, therefore, that's my argument, a left populist strategy, able to design a properly political answer. And that answer should consist in the creation of a people, a collective will, a we, that federates all the democratic demands against post-democracy and try to federate them in a way that is going to lead to a radicalization of democracy. And of course, that signify that you are going to construct a people whose adversary is the oligarchy. I think that's important to realize that it's a stake, and by understanding that, and I could give you some example if you want in the discussion about the way it can be done. For instance, the case of La France Insoumise and Jean-Luc Mélenchon, they've managed to make people understand that their enemy are not the immigrants, but they are the force of neoliberal globalization. This is what I mean to establish, a we and them being the oligarchy. But that, of course, requires to recognize the democratic nucleus, which is the origin of many of the demands, not all, of course, but many of the demands that right-wing populism expresses in a xenophobic vocabulary, and providing a different vocabulary aimed at orienting those demands towards more egalitarian objectives. Of course, I do not deny that there are people who feel completely at home, with right-wing populism reactionary values. But I'm convinced that there are others who are attracted to those parties because they feel that they are the only ones that care about their problems. And I believe that if a different language was made available, many people might experience their situation in a different way and be recruited for the progressive struggle. Of course, we must be aware of the fact that the demand that the left populist strategy seeks to articulate are very heterogeneous. And this is what they need to be articulated in what we call in the book Hegemony and Socialist Strategy that I wrote, jointly with Ernesto Laclau, a chain of equivalence. The way in which, in fact, in that book, we were already published in 1985, arguing for the need to articulate the demand of the working class with the demand of the new movement. Because we felt that the problem that the traditional social democracy was not understanding the importance of feminism, anti-racism, and already, some environmental issues. So that's what we call a chain of equivalence, to try to articulate those demands, to find form of solidarity between different demands. This process of articulation is crucial because it is by their inscription in such a chain of equivalence that singular demands acquire their political signification. So it's not so much where those demands come from that counts. Of course, it's important, but this is not really fundamental. What is fundamental is all the demands are articulated with other demands. As the example of right-wing populism testify, for instance, demand from the workers, demand for democracy coming from popular classes, can be articulated in a xenophobic vocabulary. They do not automatically have a progressive character. It is only by entering in equivalence with other democratic demands, for instance, like those of the immigrants or the feminists, that those demands will acquire a radical democratic dimension. We should never take for granted that they are struggles that are inherently emancipatory and cannot be oriented toward opposite ends. I think, for instance, that the current development of form of ecology with a clear anti-democratic characteristic should be seen as a warning that the refusal of the neoliberal model is not a guarantee of a democratic advance. With ecology, as in other domains, the question of articulation is decisive. And this is why it is essential to establish a link between the variety of democratic demands around the identification with a project of radicalization of democracy. So the objective for left populist strategy should be the creation of a popular majority that is going to come to power. And of course, it's an electoral strategy. It's a strategy that takes place within the institution. It's not a revolutionary strategy of putting an end to liberal democracy. And the aim is to establish a new hegemonic formation within the framework of liberal democracy, a new hegemonic formation that will provide the condition for a recovery and a radicalization of democracy. What's at stake is the construction of a people around a project which addresses the diverse form of subordination around issues concerning exploitation, domination, or discrimination. And this requires, of course, reasserting the importance of the social question, because we must accept that this is a question that has been recently left aside, and for me it's really also one of the reasons for the success of right-wing populism, taking, of course, account of the increasing fragmentation and diversity of the workers, but also of the specificity of other important democratic demands, for instance, about feminism, anti-racism, and those the LGBT community. A special emphasis must be given to the question that have gained particular relevance in the last 30 years and which is of special urgency today, the future of the planet. It is impossible to envisage a project for radicalization of democracy in which the ecological question is not at the center of the agenda. It is therefore essential to combine this with the social question. And this is why I'm so enthusiastic about projects like the Green New Deal that Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez is promoting in the US and also, for instance, in Britain, the Labour Party under Corbyn taken that very seriously. They speak a new green industrial revolution. I think that's absolutely crucial, the articulation of the social with the ecological question. No doubt, to abandon the productivist model and implement this project requires, what Gramsci will call an intellectual and moral reform. But I think that an ambitious and well-designed ecological project could offer an attractive vision of a future democratic society that might entice some sectors which are currently within the neoliberal hegemonic group. Because, for instance, often people say, but they are the loser and the winner of neoliberal globalization. And you can't really put those people working together or around one project. Well, I think that among the people who are profiting from neoliberal globalization and who are quite happy with that, well, those have children, they've got grandchildren, and I think they might become aware that this model, in fact, is destroying the possibility of a future for those generations. So we can really, I think, on the basis of a really well-designed ecological program, win those people for a progressive alternative. Here I want also to emphasize that the objective of a left populist strategy is not the establishment of a populist regime with a predefined program, but to bring about a new hegemonic formation that will foster the recovery and the deepening of democracy. This hegemonic formation will take different shape according to the specific trajectories involved. It could be envisaged, for instance, and this is the case of the strategy of Jeremy Corbyn in Britain, which definitely is a left populist strategy. They speak of democratic socialism. Jean-Luc Mélenchon speaks of eco-socialism. Some other people in Spain, they don't really think that speaking of socialism is particularly attractive for the new generation, so they will rather speak of participatory democracy. So there are different, it's not a regime that we are going to implement. It's creating the condition for recuperation and radicalization of democracy. The chain of equivalence to which the people is going to be constructed will also depend on historical circumstances. And its dynamic cannot be determined in isolation from the contextual references. So it's important to realize there is no blueprint for how this is going to take place, and there is no final destination. What's important, whatever the name, is the recognition that democracy is the hegemonic signifier around which the diverse struggle are articulated, and that the institution of political liberalism are not going to be discarded. Well, now, to finish, there is a question which I want really to emphasize because I think it's absolutely crucial to envisage this left populist strategy. Is the decisive role played by affects in the constitution of political identities. I think that the lack of understanding of the affective dimension in the process of identification is one of the main reasons for which the left, locked in a rationalist framework, is unable to grasp the dynamic of politics. Recognizing the central role played by affects in politics and how they can be mobilized is really decisive for designing a successful left populist strategy. Of course, here I can't develop this because it would take another presentation, but I need to indicate that this question about the role of the affects, I'm posing it within the framework of an anti-essentialist ontology that we have developed with Ernest Laclau in Hegemony and Socialist Strategy. Crucial to this framework is the assertion of the discursive nature of the social and the thesis that they are no essential identities, but only form of identification. What we call an identity is always the result of a product of an identification. What's at stake in politics is the construction of political identities, and that it always entails an affective dimension. This is crucial. And of course, this is what Freud called a libidinal investment. They're always in the construction of political identity, it's a libidinal investment. Freud, of course, is central for my reflection because besides asserting the general thesis that the social link is a libidinal link, he brought to the fore the crucial role played by the affective libidinal bonds in processes of collective identification. As he stated in his book, Group Psychology and the Analysis of the Ego, and here I quote Freud, a group is clearly held together by a power of some kind, and to what power could this feat be better ascribed than to Eros, which hold together everything in the world, end of quote. For Freud, affects are the qualitative expression of the quantity of libidinal energy of the instinct. This libidinal energy is malleable, and it can be oriented in multiple directions. It can produce different affects. I think that this point is really important to realize that different forms of politics can foster different affective libidinal attachment. And it also helps us to refute the essentialist view that adjudicate given affect to specific social agents. For instance, in France, there is a whole discussion, and it's linked to a book by Eric Fassin. We say we should not even speak with people who vote for Marine Le Pen, because those people are moved by affects which make them necessarily intrinsically sexist, racist, homophobic. So those people, nothing to do with them. I mean, this is what Macron called a leper. Well, I profoundly disagree with that thesis, because it's an essentialist thesis that people are moved there. Some people are moved only by that kind of affects. I think that affects are malleable. I mean, of course, the discourse in which those affects are going to be inscribed is crucial. You see, so they can move to different orientation. And here I think that it's interesting to complement Freud's reflection with some insight by Spinoza, a conception of affects. And namely, a distinction made by Spinoza between what he called affectio and affectus. Affectio being affection, in the fact of being affected, and affectus is affect. Like Freud, Spinoza believed that it is desire that moves human beings to act, and he notes that what makes them act in one direction rather than in another are the affects. But of course, he does not ascribe specific affect to specific people. He says it's the inscription is in which affection they are inscribed, which is going to promote some affects. An affection for Spinoza is a state of a body insofar as it is subject to the action of another body. When affected by something exterior, the conatus, and the conatus for Spinoza means the general striving to persevere in our being, and of course it's a crucial concept of Spinoza, the conatus will experience affect that will move it to desire something and act accordingly. I find this dynamic of affectio affectus very helpful to envisage the process of production of common affects. And I propose to employ this dynamic to examine the mode of construction of political identities, seeing affection as the space where the discursive and the affective are articulated in specific practices. You see, so in fact, it's against the essentialist thesis that people are moved by some affect. It depends in which discursive, affective affection practices they are going to be inscribed. This is what is going to lead them act in one way or the other, in a xenophobic way or in a way which is in fact more towards radicalization of democracy. Well, on the question of practice, because I think this idea of practice is very important, I think I also draw my inspiration from Wittgenstein, who taught us that it is by their inscription in what he called language game, and we call that with Ernesto discursive practices, that social agents form belief and desire and acquire their subjectivity. Here, in order to avoid misunderstanding, because there have been so many misunderstandings about that term of discourse that we use in hegemony socialist strategy, let me stress that by discursive, we are not referring to practice concerned exclusively with speech or writing, but signifying practices in which signification and action, so the discursive and the action, cannot be separated. In this view, allegiance in the view of Wittgenstein, allegiance to democracy is not something based on rationality, but in participation in specific form of life, in specific affection, as Spinoza will say. As Richard Rorty has often pointed out, a Wittgensteinian perspective makes us realize that allegiance to democracy and the belief in the values of its institution does not depend on giving them an intellectual foundation. There is an ongoing discussion with Habermas, who say, no, we need to, give a philosophical foundation. We need to find an argument so that people know that, democracy will be our form, of course, the way in which rational people, will necessarily act, and Wittgenstein and as Roth indicated, I totally agree with them. This is not what is important, In fact, allegiance to democratic values is a question of identification. and is created not through rational argumentation, but through an ensemble of language game practices which construct democratic form of individuality. And it is very important, Wittgenstein clearly acknowledged the affective dimension of this allegiance that he likens to what he called a passionate commitment to a system of reference. So there is something of passion in this, in the identification. So I propose to bring together Spinoza, Wittgenstein, and Freud, and to see inscription in discursive affective practice as providing the affection, which for Spinoza bring about the affect that will spur desire and lead to specific action. So here, the question of, you are inscribing some affection from practices, okay, discursive affective. That is going to produce some affects. The affects are going to produce desire, and desire needs you to act. So you see the link and why this is important to envisage, how people act politically. So by seeing, the way in which affects can spur desire and lead to specific action, we can in that way recognize that affects and desire played a crucial role in the constitution of collective identities, and that they are the moving force of political action. I submit that this recognition of the crucial role of affects and of the way they can be mobilized is decisive for envisaging democratic politics. Such a theoretical perspective is particularly useful, it seems to me, to comprehend the nature of the populist moment that we are currently witnessing, and to envisage how to face the challenge that it represents. Unfortunately, generally, left parties do not understand the importance of mobilizing affect in a democratic direction. They believe that it is something that is specific to the right, and that they should limit themselves to rational argument and deliberative procedure. And this is, in my view, why they are not able to effectively answer the challenge posed by the rise of right-wing populist movement, whose success is linked to the fact that they understand much better than the left that politics is always partisan, that it requires the creation of an us-them relation, but of course an us-them, in an agonistic form, not seeing the them as an enemy to be destroyed, but as an adversary. One crucial shortcoming of liberal democratic theories, the theories that most left parties, I'm finishing, are following, is their incapacity to acknowledge the partisan character of politics and the crucial role that affects place in politics. This incapacity is the consequence, of course, of the theoretical level of their picture of the individual presented as acting in the field of politics as moved either by the pursuit of interest or by moral concern. This precludes them from recognizing the collective nature of political actors and asking one of the key questions for politics. How are collective forms of identification created, and what is the part played by affective dimension in this process? By drawing political frontier, and this is my last paragraph, the populist moment that we are witnessing in Europe points certainly to what we can call a return of the political after years of post-politic. A return that may open the way for authoritarian solution through regimes that weaken liberal democratic institutions. That's for sure, that's a danger. But it can also lead to a reaffirmation and deepening of democratic values. Everything will depend on the kind of populism that emerge victorious from the struggle against post-politic and post-democracy. And it is imperative that progressive sectors understand the importance of involving themselves in that struggle. the thought that I would like to leave with you is that to successfully engage in that decisive struggle, it is necessary to have an adequate understanding of the role of affects in politics. Because as Spinoza was keen to stress, an affect can only be displaced by an opposed affect that is going to be stronger than the one to be repressed. Many thanks. Should I sit there or stay
Why
here?
don't you come back here? Makes it easier. The next phase is questions from the audience, one per customer, question short interrogative statement followed by a question mark. Let me just ask one while people are preparing their questions, which is, who is a left populism against? Who's the them? At one point you referred to the oligarchy. At other times you've referred to the neoliberal something. But one of the strengths of your analysis is to say politics is us against them. It's about argument. It's about debate. It's about mobilizing us of people who've been left out of whatever. Who is the them in this analysis for you? Because without a clear them, I don't think you can create an us. So
Yeah, of course.
who's the them?
Yeah. Well, the them is, for left populism, is precisely, so I say, all the forces which sustain neoliberal globalization. You know, this is, and I don't like, for instance, to speak, it's not the elites, it's not the casta. For instance, I've been having this discussion with people in Podemos. They used to speak la casta, you know. La casta doesn't mean anything, because la casta, in fact, by the way, they were, at some point, they told me, well, now that we are in power, in the Cortes, people say, but you are also a la casta, you know. So I think that they began to realize that it was not a good term to speak la casta. And I don't like the term the elites either, because elites, there are many types of elites. There are intellectual elites, there are sporting elites, and so I think that the definitively, no, but I think that and let's say, of course, it depends of the them is not something that is necessarily always you need to think in the conjuncture. I think, for instance, that today the main conjuncture that we are living, we've got the possibility of developing an alternative to neoliberalism, because I really believe that the hegemony of neoliberalism is really in trouble. And that is basically since the 2008 crisis. You know, before that, it was believed by people that this is the model that we've got. No, people don't believe that anymore. So there is a crisis of neoliberal model. It does not mean that necessarily crisis of neoliberalism economically. I mean, I'm not saying we are in the, but this model is not anymore seen as, you know, bringing the prosperity for everybody. So I think that we've got a window of opportunity in order to mobilize a lot of people who are, because in fact, people are becoming aware, not all of them, but that this post-democratic condition that we are living is a consequence of neoliberalism. So if we want to fight against post-democracy, to recover, you know, democracy, you need to put an end to neoliberalism. And so the them is all the forces, the pension fund, the banks, and not necessarily, you know, it's not individual. It's the kind of institution which really sustain the neoliberal project. This is for me what should be the them of the people. The people, of course, constructed here as a collective will, which will articulate the demand, all the democratic demand of the working class. So they are demand of economic demand, but there are also, and I think for me that's very important, series of other demand, which demand of feminists, LGBT, all that, which also are important for a project of radicalization of democracy. You know, I think we should bring those together and having as common adversary the forces of neoliberal globalization.
Okay. Let me go back row there. No, you're looking around, but I mean you. Yeah, yeah. A quick question, and then the next question will be to the right. Yeah, yeah.
Thank you very much. It's very important that your explanatory...
I don't see, where are you?
Hi.
Okay, yeah.
Mario Stabo, Corvinus University. Now you see me?
Yeah.
Your explanatory model, it's very important at the macro and meso level. So your model is based on political institutions and constituency, movements. One of your critiques, and I agree with it, that the politics, it doesn't go back to different movements and to try to hijack. But in our times, we started to discuss with ism, but shifting from the political scene, post-political, as you say, at a certain point, it's blurry. In some countries, it's getting dark, and some people outside of the political scene, as individuals, they are hijacking, or they are coming as a savior of the nation. How you explain these outliers out of your model, that it's very structural, organic, and in a continuous dynamic movement. From the perspective of affects and eliminating the logic, the political programs, the parties that are now with one-page political program, sometimes they hijack the entire political scene as individual or as a very small group of people. So how you see this?
Wait a second, because I'm not to explain what exactly. This is what
how in the post-politic era, the entire political doctrine, rationalism, is going to the facts and coming some individuals that knowing that these facts are important, they are hijacking the political power. And we talk about Trumpism, we talk about what is happening in Slovakia, actor in Ukraine. So those individuals that go up in the political scene.
Well, look, what I'm really interested there, I don't think that. Can I explain that? What interests me really, because I don't think that one can, I don't want to say, there are always, of course, people who have some hubris of power, those, well, I wouldn't call it dictator, but what for me is important is why, to try to understand why people follow them. So it's not really to say how they emerge. Because for me the political question is what is their appeal? Why do people follow them? And I do believe that in part and well, in great part is because those people manage to articulate. There is a resonance between they see what. The unsatisfied demands that exist in a society, they are aware of that, and they are able to provide a vocabulary to articulate those demands into a specific direction. But right-wing populism, so it's not so much to say why do those people appear or do they appear, but it's what is the reason for their success and the reason for them to be accepted, And I think that here my answer is because, and for me, I mean, and I always think in particular case, obviously, but for instance, the case of France is extremely important for me to understand the rise of and the success of the Rassemblement National today is clearly because they were important sector demands which, the reaction against post-democracy, I'll call that. People felt that they were not represented, that they did not have a voice, they were not taken seriously. And those people were able to articulate them. When in fact, I should maybe, I began to understand that several years ago in Austria. Because I was interested in understanding the success of Georg Haider. And in fact, I began to understand, and I began reading the book published by Haider, and in fact, you know, I began to understand, and it's been extremely important in all my reflection, that it was a consequence of the kind of a grand coalition and proper system in Austria after the war, you know, for good reason, certainly, because in order to impede that they were again a civil war, the ÖVP and the SPÖ, that is the conservative, and the, were very much in coalition. And of course, they were, if you, for instance, wanted to have a job in TV or something, if you were not a member of the black or the red, you know, you were not a chance. So a lot of people felt left out of that, you know, and Haider was very clever in trying to give a vocabulary to those elites, you know, they've taken, you know, your voice. I'm going to give it back to you. And I think that made me understand something which I saw later in other countries following the same thing. You understand what I mean by that?
Yes. Young woman down in this row, yes, right there. Yep. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm going to stand up. First, thank you very much for your presentation. I have a question regarding, let's say, the successful implementation of the, what you call the left populistic instruments, because I think that populism is mostly a rhetorical instrument right now, and I don't think, I'm wondering if a successful implementation of populistic instruments would be possible beyond the rhetorical and the discursive moment. Yeah.
I'm not sure I understand, but well, first I did not, you know, clarify that in my talk. When I speak of populism, I use the understanding of populism which is developed by Ernesto Laclau in his book On Populist Reason, where he said that populism is a strategy. It's a strategy. It's not of construction of the political frontier, you know. So it's all, and of course, in order to understand that, you need to locate yourself in a certain understanding of what is the political, which is what we call the dissociative conception of political, because there are two main conceptions of the political. One which is called the associative conception, you know, which means that the political for many people is an area of acting in common, in which we should really, you know, develop our liberty and try to establish consensus. That's a position which is dominant in many political theory. And then there is the dissociative conception that you find in Thucydides, in Machiavelli, in Hobbes, in Carl Schmitt, in Claude Lefort, and in our work. We say, no, politics is about conflict. You know, there is necessarily antagonism. And of course, you can only understand populism if you locate yourself in this dissociative conception. If you locate yourself into the associative, you need necessarily to see populism as something, you know, irrational, something dangerous, something which is a perversion of democracy. But if you understand that populism is about that politics is about the construction of political frontier, and in fact, you know, the problem with post-politics and the problem with social democratic parties is that they don't realize that. They believe that you know, politics is not, it's trying to establish consensus. And this is the strength of the populists, to say, no, they intervene, they establish a frontier. Say, no, there is us and them. But of course, the whole question is how you construct this political frontier. You see, this is, so this is an understanding of populism. Populism is not a regime, it's not an ideology, it's not something that has a specific content, and is not something that can it can be combined with many different forms of institutions. For instance, the kind of populism I defend is something which is definitively compatible with liberal democratic institutions. But it's also other form of populism. So this is why I think it's important to understand that for me the strength and the success of the right-wing populism is because they reintroduce, it's a return of the political, as I say, and the moment in which, and then you mobilize people. In order to mobilize people, to mobilize affect, you need to have a political frontier. You can't mobilize affect around this idea of we are all agree, you see? And I think that that's what is important to understand. But this, of course, is a specific understanding of populism. And there are many other understandings, but this is the one that I utilize in my work.
Okay, another question. A question, yes, there, and then I'll come forward. So hang on, we'll get to you. Question there, and then we'll come forward here, the next one. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor. My question to you would be about the attitude, if you think there is any, that the left populism would take towards globalization, if you think there is a single one. And allow me to clarify, the one formulation that I really like is that our main problem is that capital is global, but control over it is local. So if you think that story is productive, you would say, well, either we need to deglobalize capital and control it democratically at the level of nations, which is more or less what the populist right is saying. There's another one that would say, well, no, globalization has benefits. We just need to control capital democratically at the global level, if that's even possible, which I know is very hard. Now, again, the right mostly went for let's deglobalize, control nationally. The left sometimes says that, but doesn't seem to be very consistent about it. Now, in your mind, is there a single stance there that it would be good for the left to take? Do we deglobalize or do we globalize democratically?
Well, it's true that there is discussion among left populism about that. I mean, I will say that left populism is and must be, I mean, according to my understanding, critical of neoliberal globalization, obviously, because this, I think that in fact, a lot of people think about it. I was last week in Vienna in a conference of Danny Roderick, which was quite interesting because, in fact, he was also defending the idea of a good populism. He was speaking, he said there is a bad populism, which is the populism of identities, but he speaks of economic populism, a populism that will be precisely envisaged in terms of creating, putting into question form of political equalities. And he's precisely insisting, he's critiquing what he called hyper-globalization. He said that the problem of today is hyper-globalization. He's not against globalization. And for instance, well, I'm not an economist, so for me it was not easy to understand some, but he was defending the Bretton Woods argument, period, for instance. He was saying this is something, so you see, to answer your question, again, I'm not an economist, but I believe that they are certainly form of globalization which will be compatible with this form of the neoliberal globalization is not the only form of globalization. And I think that it's interesting to see that people come like Danny Roderick think of what will be a form of globalization that will be against neoliberal, against hyper-globalization. So this is how I would think, because of course I also agree that the solution, and I think that for me is definitively one of the main weakness of right-wing populism, is the idea that you can come back, but basically, in fact, they are taking different positions with respect to that. Because, for instance, recently, for a long time, they were even against Europe. Now, even Marine Le Pen is changed her mind with respect to that, because they are becoming big realistic that coming back to one single nation is you can't. That will be absolutely impossible. So I think that what we need to envisage is that form of globalization that will be more compatible with the defense of politics of redistribution. We do not need to be against globalization, but against the form of neoliberal globalization.
Okay. question here. Yeah. Yeah.
Thanks. I wanted to say, first, I completely agree with you on the affect and the deficits of the left in recognizing the role of affect in politics. But I wanted to go a little further on the question, the concept of left populism. I'm worried about it because I study Latin America, where left populism has reigned. But what I see is the logic of both any kind of populism as being anti-pluralist, and the electoral logic that if they're not winning elections, it must be because they're not fair elections. And then the us versus them polarization strategy that they're creating. They may be creating the kind of political frontier you're talking about, but the very severe polarization that can cause, combined with the electoral logic, to me brings an authoritarian tendency very easily. So I'm wondering if what you really mean by left populism is more of rebalancing, bringing back the popular sovereignty side of liberal democracy, but in a pluralist way, and that you're really asking for a left, more socially just, redistributive, pluralist liberal democracy, as opposed to a left populism, which worries me. And it may just be semantic, but I wanted to ask if it was conceptual or semantic.
I understand what you say. Well, two things. First, with respect to Latin America, I don't think, but they are for different experiences, but I know particularly well the experience of Argentina and Kirchnerismo, and that was really, well, there are different things. Left populist strategy. It's not a regime, it's just a way in which you are going to construct the we. And in the case of the Kirchner, it was a very pluralistic, certainly much more pluralistic than today the government of Mauricio Macri. So I think it's usually left populism is presented in Latin America as being necessarily authoritarian, and the fact that having a leader, well, in fact, maybe I could speak 1 hour about that, so it's probably best not to leave it like that, because Michael is going to get nervous about it. But so I think that, I think we agree, yeah, definitively for me left populism is something which is pluralistic. And I totally disagree, for instance, with people like Jan Werner Müller or Cas Müder, who believe that populism is necessarily, anti-pluralistic. It can be, of course, but it's not necessarily. And I think, for instance, in the construction of the chain of equivalence, this is something which is definitively very pluralistic. And in fact, yeah, because this is something on which I've been thinking recently, and the kind of left populism strategy that I defend is some kind of radical social democracy, but of course it's not coming back. There is no coming back to social democracy, and I mean the high point of social democracy. For instance, people like Kreisky in Austria, Olof Palme in Sweden. In fact, those were populists, and I think the best social democracy at the moment were form of populism. But today, of course, I'm not saying we should go back first, or there are many reasons why we can go back. First, for instance, the question of ecological issue is something that would absolutely impede coming back to the kind of Keynesian productivist thing. We can't go back that way, On the other side, and this is what we were criticizing in hegemony socialist strategy, the traditional social democracy, even the more radical, was not enough aware or did not acknowledge enough that it was too much centered on question of economics and the working class, we need to have a social democracy that will make room for anti-racism, for all those questions. So, and that's a big difference. For instance, in fact, in hegemony socialist strategy in 1985, what we were arguing was, in fact, for a radicalization of social democratic model. But that, of course, did not happen, because what happened is the moment when, the contrary, we had the neoliberal revolution with Thatcher. But I think that there was a moment in which this, And there are aspects very interesting, for instance, in particular in Sweden, the minor plan, you know, there were moments, there are forms of social democracy that were very radical, you know, and they could have been developed, but of course there was completely a moment in which that was stopped because of the development of neoliberalism and because of the capitulation of social democracy to neoliberalism. So we could certainly revive, reformulate, reestablish a link with social democracy, but it needs to be a new social democracy, a new model, much more radicalized, much more in terms of understanding that there are many forms of subordination, which is not only economic form of discrimination. But yes, in fact, you know, for left populism, I propose to understand this model in terms of what I call a radical reformism. And I see there are three forms. If we think of the left, we could think of three forms. There's the pure reformism, you know, of the social liberal, what social democracy is become today. That's one way. So accepting the neoliberal hegemony and make it more human. On the other extreme, you've got the revolutionaries who say, no, we've got to bring down liberal democracy because they are really capitalist. And there's, so I'm not in favor of that either. I think that left populism is a form of radical reform. André Gorz, the French sociologist, at a nice expression, was speaking of non-reformist reform. You know, to have reform that in fact are going to have got a subversive element. And I think this is how I understand left populism.
I think we're going to have to draw it there because we've come to 7 o'clock. There are all kinds of things I take from this. A contrast between associative visions of politics and dissociative ones that insist that politics is about drawing lines. You use the very useful phrase of creating a frontier. Politics is about creating a frontier, and when you create a frontier, you create choice. And it's a very powerful call for choice, and a very powerful argument that a lot of the populist moment from the right is a response to the collapse of choice in a long period of politics that goes back to the 1980s. And this seems to me a very profound insight to how we got to where we are, and for that alone, I thank you most warmly. I want to just announce two things. As always, we provide a drink and a pogach and things upstairs in N13, the aula, so everybody is welcome. From CU, from outside, join us in the hall, N13. And the final lecture in this series will be given on the 29th of March at 5:30. Please mark your... May. Oh my God, what am I doing? I've done that twice today. There's some weird thing going on in my mind. The 29th of May. Repeat, the 29th of May. The 29th of May at 5:30. By one of the greatest political and moral philosophers of our age, Charles Taylor. Charles Taylor will be here on the 29th of May at 5:30 in this auditorium. Everyone here tonight is welcome. It remains for me to thank Chantal Mouffe for a fascinating lecture. Thank you.